Call the meeting to order at like 7:08. That, thank you.
Hey, Stuart, I'm Mary Ann Witherall. I had emailed you.
Jennifer Kyle. Hi, this is the new person.
Thank you. Sorry that we're, do you want me to come around? I feel,
You're more than welcome, but you're more than welcome to stay, and we could have a man's side and a woman's side. I mean, this, you have this gender divide.
I want us to stare right at Stuart awkwardly.
it's just,
All right, so it's, we're calling the meeting to order. Let me first, do a first roll call about who's here. Ginny?
Jennifer Dial, aye.
Mary Ann Witherall's here.
Tom Reardon here?
Darren
Oh,
Silver's
present.
Aye.
All right, so we've taken care of that. I am very grateful for all of you who have arrived. I hope we'll get some people on Zoom, and I hope that some tardy people may still arrive. But I am hugely grateful to our guest this evening, who has trekked all the way down here to try to give us some insight and greater insight and an opportunity to understand the law better and also best practices. Stuart Saginaw is the executive director of the Community Preservation Coalition. That this is a group that works night and day to try to advance the interest of these 193 communities that are part of the CPC and CPA. And he lives and breathes this. And so this is an opportunity for each of us on this committee to understand a little bit more about how it works and what's going on in the legislature right now that's positive and negative, and then best practices of who's doing this well and where can we learn. So with no further ado, let me turn it over to Stuart. And again, my thanks for being here.
I appreciate it. I always enjoy coming out. My favorite part of the job, the CPA communities. Just gets us spread. I appreciate it. So Tom, if it's okay with you, I'd like to do this interactively. So if people on the committee or guests have questions, ask along the way, if that's okay with you.
That's perfect with me.
Waiting till the end sometimes, I
Nope.
think.
Great. The more interaction,
Yeah.
great, the better.
Absolutely. The CPA is, it's pretty complicated. I have to say, I wish that the law was a simple, easy cut and paste, but it's not. And that's why you have a community preservation committee to kind of understand these things and educate the whole town about TPA. So tonight, I'd like to just give you kind of a high level view of what's happening statewide with CPA. With other communities, with adoption, new communities, the money for the matching funds is always a big topic of conversation. And then dig into some of the best practices, as Tom talked about, and the allowable uses of CPA.
Good.
So let me just quickly tell you about, why is that not working? It worked so well. Let's go. All right. Sorry, so let's move this.
Help you.
This is gonna work. It's not even advancing the slides at all. Okay. Sorry about this, folks.
Never seen a machine not work faithfully.
Technology.
Yeah.
Clause alive and well.
Yeah.
Success.
You've made,
The question is, what did I do to make it work, right? And, oh, it's working now. Okay. Just need a push it.
Little love. Pardon me?
Paul Brady's on Zoom.
Oh, great.
oh,
By all means, promote him.
All right, super.
Paul, Paul is the selectman representative
Oh, terrific.
on the CPC.
Okay,
So it's
All
great
right.
to have him.
excellent. Welcome, Paul, wherever you are out there. So this is our organization, the Community Preservation Coalition. We're a nonprofit based in Boston, but we're really just a combobulation of all these other nonprofit organizations from the areas of CPA, housing organizations, open space, recreation, and historic preservation. We have someone from each of these organizations on our steering committee. We have 8 people from local CPCs that sit on our steering committee, some at-large folks. So there are 21 members of our steering committee that kind of advise the coalition and set the policy and the legislative policy. We've been passed around in terms of a home base from these organizations, but we're in the offices of the Trust for Public Land and have been there for quite a while in their offices, primarily because they're the closest to the State House of all these places. So like today where I was at the State House, it's a popular place for us to have to head up to from the office. This is a snapshot of what we do, and it's really no different than other municipal organizations that serve various boards in town. So if you're on, is the CONSCOM representative here tonight?
No, he's not, but
If you're on the
changing.
CONSCOM, you have MACC that kind of represents your interests on Beacon Hill and does education and training. The selectmen have the Mass Municipal Association. There's a Moderators Association. There's a Lawyers Association. And we're that organization for the 196 cities and towns that have CPA, and particularly the Community Preservation Committee in those organizations. So the things we do are typical of those organizations. I think the 2 most used services are our technical assistance. We probably answer about 4,000 questions on CPA every year. And our advocacy work, which I think is our most valuable service. You know, you're not, you might, dig into CPA on your own and find the answer to your question. But you're probably not going to go up to Beacon Hill and walk the halls and talk to 4 or 5 legislators or more on things that would make the program better or against things that wouldn't make the program better. And so that's what we do on your behalf and on behalf of all the CPA communities. We're pretty lean and mean. That's our communications director there. On election day in Milton a few years ago with his lovely wife, they were campaigning for CPA, and they did pass in Milton. And we're about to hire an advocacy and research person as well. So we'll be a 3-person organization back up to full staffing pretty soon. Folks always ask how we support ourselves. So I always like to tell that. Just like any other nonprofit, we apply for grants and foundations and that sort of thing. Those nonprofit organizations you saw help us out a little bit, both in kind. But by and large, our membership dues that you folks pay voluntarily as a member of the coalition does bring in probably about 80% of our budget. And we're really grateful that 99.9% of all communities in the state that are eligible to join have, and we appreciate it. And we're grateful. We couldn't do the work without it. So thank you very much. And we're very cognizant of, you don't have to support the coalition. But everyone seems to feel that we do provide a service that is worth it. So thank you. Thank you so much. One thing I want to point out, these little things down the corner here, we call them bookmarks. You're going to get a copy of this presentation tomorrow. And there are, 10 or so bookmarks here, which have links. You'll see the links in the email tomorrow morning from Chase, our communication director. And that'll bring you to our website. More information on that particular slide on our website. So you'll get that in the morning. And I think we have a pretty up-to-date list of your members. Hopefully most of you get our CPA newsletter. This is our website, which, we really put a lot of time and effort into, primarily because the state doesn't have anything on CPA on their website. You can look till the cows come home. You'll find a copy of the money they distribute for the trust fund, and that's about it. So people think we're a state agency all the time because it's, when you Google CPA, you're going to come up with our site. And we put an extensive amount of work into getting the resources out there for you. Particularly, I want to call attention to this tab. That's really home base for community preservation committees. That's where we have a big super menu that opens, and there's literally hundreds of articles and pieces of information on CPA on that technical assistance sections of our website. So if you have a question, and you're thinking, I wonder if there's more information on it, it's probably there. And if it's not, you pick up the phone and you call us or shoot us an email. We're happy to help you. All right, so let's look at CPA statewide and see what's happening with it. It's amazing how it has grown over the years. We're up to 55% of the communities in the state that have CPA. The cities were very slow to adopt. In the past decade, though, they've really come on strong. So most of the gateway cities have come into the program in the past decade or so. So Fall River, New Bedford, Boston, Chelsea, Springfield, Pittsfield, Holyoke, Worcester just passed CPA, Salem, Beverly. A lot of these cities were not original adopters of the program. It's much harder to get a voluntary tax increase in a city when you have a huge population with a varying range of socioeconomic abilities. So it took a little while, but we are really pleased that most of the cities that really could use funding for these things have joined the program. And that's led to, almost 3/4 of the people in the state now live in a community. We're really proud of this last stat. You folks don't have to stay in CPA. You could revoke it the same way you adopted it by going back to the ballot. But no community ever has. Everyone that has adopted the program has found it incredibly useful and has stayed in the program. I don't know if we'll be able to say that forever. I hope Cohasset is not the one where I have to stop saying that. I doubt it. But it is a real testament to the program that no one has opted out of CPA once they've had it. And programs that are built on a tax surcharge are not always going to be supported by everybody, but still the majority of folks do believe in it and want to keep it. This is the map of CPA. The green are the towns that have the program, and then the orange are those cities that I've been talking about that have really started to populate the map a lot more over the past 10 years. You can see it's pretty uneven across the state. We have a couple big swaths of white. This is not for lack of effort on the part of a lot of these communities to adopt CPA in the past. But it tends to be a little bit more conservative part of the state, I think. So they've been a little slower to come along. I think I understand what's going on here. These communities called the Highlands in Massachusetts are all incredibly small. A lot of them you probably will not have heard of. Did anyone know that there's a Peru, Massachusetts, or a Florida, Massachusetts? They're tiny. So the amount of money they would generate wouldn't do a heck of a lot, unfortunately. And they're probably, would be very difficult to generate 9 volunteers to sit on a committee when the same folks, sit on all the different boards in town. So I can kind of understand it there. This area of the state does seem to be filling in a little bit. Like I said, Worcester just passed. These communities are all pretty recent. So I do think it is sort of spreading into Worcester County a little bit. And we do, you'd think that after 23 years, no new communities would be interested, that everyone who, wanted to be in it would have been in it already. Yet we still have probably 20 communities actively working on it right now for the presidential ballot. The presidential ballot in November is traditionally a big spot where folks try to adopt CPA. The widest variety of voters come out, and it gives a nice cross section of town voters. It's really the best place to measure whether the community wants CPA with the biggest turnout. So I think we're going to have a lot of communities on the ballot next year, which is both good and bad, as we'll talk about. So any way you look at this program, whether you look at that map or you look up the statistics of what's been done with the money, which are on the screen now, it's been a huge success. I don't think anyone ever imagined in their wildest dreams that, in just 20 years, we'd be up at $3.4 billion of money raised. Remember, it's a restricted fund. There's only 4 categories. So that's a significant amount of money across the state that has been raised for these 4 categories. Historic preservation is the most popular category in terms of numbers of projects. However, the money rolls up pretty evenly across all the 4 categories. So historic has a lot more projects, but they tend to be a little smaller. The housing and open space projects tend to be very large. We're, up over 35,000 acres of open space has been protected. recreation is definitely the hottest category of CPA. I think you guys just did a big recreation project last year. There were some changes made to the program in 2012 that made it a little easier for communities to spend their recreation money. And you couldn't have done that project that you're doing 10 years ago when the legislation said you couldn't rehab existing recreational facilities. So, we saw the need for that. Communities really wanted that. It took us 5 years to convince the legislature to make that change. But because we did, now you're able to use that, and we see tremendous growth in the number of projects in outdoor recreation. And we're closing in on 30,000 units of affordable housing in the state. Clearly of these 4 areas, this is the one that has the greatest need across the state. And, it's really hurting our competitiveness in Massachusetts that we just don't have enough affordable housing. So that has been really a focus for a lot of our communities. So, well, let's continue with the money a little bit and talk about the different revenue sources of CPA. So for you folks, you have a local surcharge that your electorate agreed to when you adopted CPA. It's a 1.5% property tax surcharge. So we call that your local revenue that comes in throughout the year. And then by being in the CPA program, you get a distribution from the state trust fund. And it is a true trust fund. And I'll explain in a minute. But the legislature can do nothing with the money in that trust fund except pay it out to you folks as an annual distribution every November 15th. The amount can vary, but you will get a distribution from the trust fund automatically every November 15th. You also get interest from your money that you have in the bank, accounts that you haven't spent yet. The town is investing that along with their free cash. And if it earns interest, then the town is required to track that and pay that back into your fund for you folks to use for projects in the subsequent year. Yes,
Can I ask a question?
sure.
I thought that there were 2 amounts of surcharge possible. Is that not true?
You might be referring to the 2 amounts of the annual trust fund distribution?
Percentage. I thought, wasn't it one time to 3% and 1.5%?
I don't think Cohasset that is a
No, I
feature of
mean,
the program.
statewide.
Okay. Communities can choose whatever surcharge they want. So we have a couple communities at 0.5%, that's the lowest. And then we have a range, we had a community at 1.1%. I don't know why, but we did. A lot of communities at 1, 1.5, some at 2. I think we have 1 community at 2.5, and then we have about 70 communities at 3%. So you choose what surcharge level you want when you adopted the program, and you can change that at any time. So we've had about a dozen communities that have raised their surcharge, and we've had about a dozen that have lowered their surcharge that had other priorities come along. So that's up to you folks, and you chose a 1.5% surcharge. We call that the Goldilocks surcharge. It's not too high at 3%. You don't get any money. And actually, as an interesting statistic, if you look at the success ratio of communities on the ballot by what percentage they try for, 1.5% has like an 83% success ratio. The community puts it on the ballot at 1.5%, 83% of the time they pass. All the other surcharge are in the high 50s or low 60s. So it's dramatically different. So that's why we kind of, we love that 1.5% surcharge because it seems very appropriate for a lot of communities. So welcome to the Goldilocks land, having a CPA. I was talking about this interest. It never used to amount to much, but it's amounting to a good chunk of change now to be added into your fund. So I have seen examples where communities did not get their interest, where the municipal officials were not aware of it or it was an honest mistake. I did check. There's a form called the CP2. Have you ever seen that before? That's your profit and loss statement on your CPA program. The town is required to file that form every summer when they close the books on the town's finances. They're required to file the CP2 with the Department of Revenue. And that form has basically everything about the finances of your program. It shows you how much you spent that year, in which categories, what are the account balances of all the different categories of CPA, whether you hit your 10% goals that the law requires, which I'll describe in a minute, how much you spend on administrative funds, how much you got in interest. And I find so many times that the municipal officials don't think to give the CPC a copy. But you should ask for that. It's required to be done by October 31st. A little bit of warning is when I went to check that form to make sure you were getting interest, I did find that you have been getting interest in previous years, but the CP2 was for FY 23 for last fiscal year. So before DOR comes knocking on your door for that form, I would encourage you to check with your finance department and make sure that they get that form submitted to the Department of Revenue. October 31st.
What was your source on that? Because I'm almost sure that was filed in the fall.
Yeah, it's not on DOR's website. It's,
Yep.
now it's possible that, you know, DOR just didn't, for some reason.
But, okay, we'll check on it. But
Yeah, there
I
is
recall
there's
that,
a website where you can see the CP2 of every community in the state.
Yep.
It's pretty new. We asked DOR to put that up so that communities could check for themselves and see what's on there. And I
it should be distributed to all the members of the CPC as well,
Absolutely.
which it has not been. But I do,
Yeah.
we talked with the town manager in the fall and they had completed it and were sending it in. So I assume it's
Well,
somewhere.
there's also other forms, so you might be confusing it with CP1.
Could well
The
be.
CP1 is the form that reports how much you raised locally. Says we took in this amount of money in CPA local surcharge, send us our matching money. So no one forgets to file the CP1, but you don't get a match unless you file the CP1.
That's probably what it was.
So I can guarantee you there were 196 CP1s that were at the state. But the CP2 is a little bit of work on the accounting side, you know, to get all those. It's a pretty long form. It's a couple pages of data. So
But it was up to date prior to 23, is that?
I looked at 22 only and it was there.
Okay.
And you got, I think, $5,500 in interest in
Okay.
22. So the town is aware and has been
Yeah.
paying interest,
Good.
which is great. But there was no form listed for 23. So check on that. And I can, Tom, if they say they filed it, I can send you the link if you want.
Okay.
Follow up of where DOR's website shows that it's missing if you.
Okay,
But it is possible they submitted it and it just didn't get
so
transmitted.
we'll see. It could also be that I'm talking about CP1.
Yeah.
These are kind of refinements that are.
That one's even due earlier. That one's due September 15th.
Yep.
So they have time to calculate the trust fund. So. All right, so let's talk about the money a little bit more and the trust fund particularly. A common misconception is that the money from the trust fund comes from the state's general fund. It's in the state budget. And it is not. It is so much better than that. It is a dedicated funding source just for CPA. Every time people file a document anywhere at the state's registries of deeds across the state, there is a fee that they pay to the state for that document. Most of the fee goes to the general fund, the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But the first $50 of every document in any registry goes to the CPA trust fund. And it's a true trust fund. It's collected at the window at the registry, forwarded to the Department of Revenue. They deposit it in the CPA trust fund. That trust fund earns interest every year and it adds up to a lot because there's millions in there. And then they pay it out every year on November 15th to the CPA communities. It is a funding source that any other special interest program would kill to have. The legislature, it's not subject to appropriation by them. It happens automatically. And, you know, they can't change it to another funding source. Conversely, the state's budget, you know, everyone goes hat in hand up to the legislature every single year. There's a 6-month advocacy project where you're fighting for your, you know, money to be included in the budget again, and things get cut and added and cut and added. And it's a, you know, quite a sausage making process up there. But CPA doesn't have to worry about that because it's a dedicated funding source. So it is terrific. The problem is it's not enough money. It's never enough money, right? This fee used to be $20 and $10. There's one document that is a different fee. It's the municipal lien certificate for some reason. So for the first, from 2001, when CPA first came on board, to 2019, that fee was 20. And we started noticing around 2007 that the match was starting to fall. More communities were coming into CPA, less real estate activity was happening, and the trust fund started plummeting. And so we began advocating for them to raise that fee in 2007. It took us till 2019 to finally have success on that. You know, bills are very tough to pass at the legislature. Bills where you're asking for money are almost impossible. But we got it done finally, a Herculean effort by many communities across the state. You know, some of you might have even responded to our panicked advocacy emails asking you to call your state rep and your legislator. You've seen those from a lot of different organizations. But we got it done. They raised it, and it had a dramatic impact on the match, which was terrific. In those, 12 years it took us to pass it, the legislature started doing something for CPA. They said to us, look, we can't raise that fee right now. In the beginning, it was a recession, and then we were recovering from the recession, and then there was other pressures. They said, we can't raise it right now. We'll start giving you extra money from the state's budget surplus. After all the regular budget things happen, there is a surplus most years. So they began a process. We have to ask for that. This is automatic. That we have to go up starting in the spring and advocate for 6 months to get that money. But I think 9 out of the last 12 years, we have gotten surplus money. It's added up to about $118 million. So not an insignificant amount of money from our work on advocacy. But unfortunately, that didn't happen this year. So we've got a double whammy going on. The green revenue, which comes in from registry of deeds fees, has fallen 30% in the past year. And we were unsuccessful in getting surplus money this year because there was no budget surplus from the state. So that added up to a lower match this year. Your match was a 21% match. And when we say 21%, we mean 21% of what you raised locally. So every community that was less than a 3% surcharge got 21% of what they raised locally on that first round of funding at CPA. So you got 21% of whatever, that added up to 126,000. Boston got 21% of theirs, which added up to, 3 million. Gosnold, our smallest community, got 21% of $5,000, which is what they raised for the entire year for CPA, and that was their check. Anyone know where Gosnold is? Anyone a sailor? You're a boater. You know where Gosnold is. Cuttyhunk, Elizabeth Islands, the third set of islands off Cape Cod. There are not very many people that live there, but the whole islands together are called the town of Gosnold. And I think there were 50 people at town meeting, and that was everyone comes to town meeting and voted on CPA. So that was down from 38% the year before. Before, we had more money from the registries, a little bit more. It's been down for quite a while. And we got 20 million from the surplus. So that gave us 38%, lower registry fees, no money from the surplus, 21%. We will struggle to get to 21% again next year. You're probably working on your budgeting very soon for FY25. DOR will give us a little sneak peek about that next month or March. But we would suggest to be very conservative in the state match money. Definitely project lower than 20%. Because it's going to be difficult unless interest rates, if the Fed brings down interest rates and refinancing start happening again, then I think the trust fund will come back. And someday that will happen. But I don't think they're going to be dramatically slicing interest rates in the next year. It's going to take some time for that. And anyone who could refinance did so when the interest rates were low. No one's refinancing now, and all those refinancings generated fees at the registry. So Any questions on the trust fund or how that all works?
What's what's kind of the long run average match rate?
Oh, it has been up and down.
Yeah.
So what year did you adopt CPA? Do you remember, Russ?
Pretty sure.
2001, yeah,
Yeah.
okay. So for the
Yeah.
first 6 years, you got 100% match. Because there were no cities in the program, there were small communities, interest rates were dropping. People were refinancing in January, interest rates would drop another 2 points, they'd refinance in July, and then they refinance again in December. I don't know if you remember those days. But with that activity at the registry, home sales, people were flipping houses, remember that time? It was really overheated. We paid for it, 2007, but, the fees at the registry really added up to a lot. And then it started falling pretty quick and it got down to, with surplus money, the lowest we got was 17%. And then we got the fees raised and it went right back up to 45%, I think, and 38% last year. So the matches have been pretty good for the past, 3-4 years because of that fee increase, but the gravy train is a little bit slowing down. So hopefully that trust fund will come back. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, what you folks do and the best practices and the things that hopefully you haven't forgotten about as you move throughout the year. There are some ongoing things that every CPC is responsible for in the law. You have to hold at least one public hearing every year, and so hopefully you're doing that. And that's designed to get input from the public and what they'd like to see in CPA. You have hopefully a community preservation plan. You have a written community preservation plan, or is that what you're working? Actually, that's what you're working on now, right?
That's what we'll be
Okay,
doing
great.
next.
So once that's done, you'll update that every year after hearing from the public. And,
Right.
if you list the members of the committee in that plan, you'll update that. If you list the projects you did last year, you'll add the new projects into that plan. So just a light update on your plan will be required every year once it's done. You want to make sure that you are looking at the spreadsheets of what's in your various accounts. A lot of times I see CPCs don't get get that information on a regular basis, and you should be getting that on the same schedule that every other department head. So someone runs the Council on Aging, and there's a regular report on how they're doing against their budget, whether it's once a week, once a month. CPA should get the same thing. But a lot of times, town officials don't think about that because you're not a department and you don't have a department head, but you do have your own segregated account and you should be getting regular financial on that. So that's something to ask for if you're not seeing. And these last two things, that's kind of the meat and potatoes of what a CPC does. It prepares an annual budget every year, presents that to town meeting, and it makes recommendations on projects. So these are really the two meat and potato things that a CPC is responsible for. And luckily, the state thinks of CPA as a local program. Officially, it's called a local option program. And they've really kept their mitts off in terms of dictating to you what you can do with your own money, mostly, or even the state money. There are very few rules and no's in CPA within those 4 categories. We're going to go over the ones that do exist. But this is the only one regarding spending. The only requirement regarding spending is every year you have to spend or reserve for later spending 10% of your annual revenue that you expect to receive in each of the 3 main categories. So if you expect, do you remember what your annual budget is? Anyone have an idea? Is it around
The state bank.
everything together? Maybe
I
600,000?
was gonna say 650.
Yeah.
Okay, so that would mean, let's say it's 600,000, that every year you have to either put in the housing reserve account $60,000 or spend $60,000 on a project out of the annual revenue. So that's the only requirement on spending. 10% for housing, 10% for open space and rec. Open space and rec share a reserve account. When we say open space with CPA, we mean conservation land, primarily buying conservation land. And when we say recreation, we're talking about outdoor recreation, parks, playgrounds, athletic fields, community gardens, trails, that sort of thing. And they share a reserve account, so you can spend 10% on either of those two categories and fulfill the requirement. And then 10% on historic. And the rest of the money is yours to do what you want with. You can bank that money and save it year to year. You can add it to projects in each of these three categories. You can one year spend it all on one category, and the next year a great project comes in that's pretty expensive and you spend it all on a different category. It's completely flexible. And that, is really your main job, is to figure that out, figure out what are the priorities of the town, what projects, should receive the funding every year. Most communities receive more applications than they have funding. Most years, not every year, but most years they do. And that's why you have a CPC to kind of parse through that.
When you say completely flexible, it's completely flexible within the CPA structure.
Yeah, that is one of the, I think we probably get to that, the no supplanting rule. You can never, there's a big firewall between the CPA account and the town's general fund, and the money from CPA never find its way back into the town's general account or supplant spending that the town does out of its general account. So that's one of the main no-nos, going way back to the Prop 2.5 law, basically. You'd be in violation of Prop 2.5 if you were taking money from CPA and having it go into the town's general fund, because then you'd be raising more money than 2.5% increase every year. So that's not allowed. And then you can also set aside 5% for an administrative fund, to pay a minute secretary or some administrative support, appraisals on land you want to buy, consultants that you might want to look at historic preservation plans of a project and make sure they're adhering to the proper standards. All those sort of things are fair game out of the administrative of CPA. So that administrative fund, folks often ask, what do communities across the state use that for? So I'd say anecdotally about 2/3 of the communities have a part-time CPA administrator. I think maybe only Boston, Somerville, Newton, Brookline, maybe the only ones that have a full-time person, much larger than Cohasset. Most communities have a part-time person. And then we have, the 35% of the communities or so who do all the work, the volunteers do all themselves. So it really depends upon what you folks want to do. That's up to your committee, how you want to spend that administrative fund. But as I mentioned, anything in terms of due diligence for projects, that would be the main use of that fund. So if someone comes to you from the CONSCOM and says, we want to buy this piece of open space, well, you need an appraisal on that. CPA requires that. Town probably doesn't have, $5,000 tucked aside anywhere, just waiting for a piece of open space to come along to do an appraisal. But you folks have that money, hopefully in your administrative budget, if town meeting authorized that as part of your annual budget. And you can make a motion. I move that we spend up to $5,000 to do an appraisal on the Johnson property. All those in favor? Aye, and it's done. So those are things that your committee is in charge of and can do that. You can even take the newspaper ads that you have to put in, for your public hearing. You can take that money out. It is not a fund to supplement projects. That's a question we get a lot. We forgot about one little thing, or costs came in much higher than they expected. Can we supplement the project budget with the administrative fund? And that is a definite no-no. So there's two firewalls, I guess, with CPA, between the general fund and CPA, and between CPA project expenses and CPA administrative expenses. So the administrative fund can't be used to supplement things that are cost overrun, so they forgot about. Yeah.
The administrative fund, does that have to go through town hall? Is that something?
It has to go through
Town meeting?
to be authorized. So when you submit your annual budget to the CPC, when you tell town meeting you'd like to set aside 10% in each of these three categories, you can put money in, other reserve accounts. At that point, usually most communities ask town meeting to authorize 5% for the administrative fund.
No specifics, just.
I mean,
5%.
Cities, sometimes the city council gets a little prickly and they want to see a specific budget, but most times you don't know.
Don't know what's coming.
You don't know what kind of projects are gonna walk in the door. You don't know if you're gonna need an appraisal or, a historic preservation consultant. You just don't know. So the good thing about the administrative fund, this is a very important thing. There's no danger in setting aside that 5%. Because whatever you don't use, and most communities don't use anything close to 5%, whatever you don't use, the town automatically, when they close the books, puts it back in your CPA fund balance, your undesignated fund at the end of the year. And then town meeting hopefully gives you a new 5%. So that's the only account in CPA that only lasts for 1 year. It's an operating fund for your committee use for 1 year. And then they put back whatever you didn't spend into your general CPA, and town meeting gives you a new one. So there's no danger. If you're the Council on Aging and you have a budget, of $200,000 for the year, and you only spend 190, well, guess what? The Council on Aging loses that $10,000. That goes back to the town, free cash and general fund. But with CPA, it doesn't work that way. The money stays in the CPA fund. And so there's really no danger in asking for that appropriation at the beginning of the year. So I don't know if you ask for 5%.
Yeah.
You do, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a smart thing to do.
I don't think we spent more than $3,000 or $4,000.
Yeah, it's very rare.
When we did the church project, we were getting grief from a lot of people.
Yeah,
That year we spent.
some consultants and things like that, yeah. Yes,
Often that a CPA committee does an appraisal of a project instead of the project doing their own appraisals and presenting it to us, like that we almost question their work.
yeah, so an appraisal, when you're buying land, you're talking about.
Yes, or a historic project or
Well, historic projects don't usually need appraisals.
a consultant, let's say, that you,
What's that?
or a consultant, that you would bring in someone to, okay, well, let's say it is buying a property.
Okay,
Get an appraisal.
right.
So you would appraise the property in addition to the project that comes before you.
Well, the CPA requires an appraisal. In other words, they want to make sure, the state wants to make sure that if you have agreed to pay $1 million to buy this piece of conservation land, that it's really worth $1 million. Because it's
Okay.
public money, right? So it's a checks and balances to make sure that you're not overpaying for that property. As a private individual, you want to bid $100,000 over asking price on Russ's property when he moves out of town someday. You're more than welcome to bid over $100,000. There's nothing against that. But when you're using public money, you really don't, public usually doesn't take too well to overpay. So the law requires an appraisal. So usually conservation land purchases will come to you from the CONSCOM or maybe a land trust that is wanting the town to do that. Sometimes the appraisal is already done, that they've already done the appraisal. Sometimes the seller has given the land trust or the town or the CONSCOM an appraisal that they did. You don't want to use that appraisal. It's unbelievable, but whenever you look at an appraisal done by the seller and an appraisal done by the buyer, the one by the buyer is always lower and the one by the seller is always higher, right? Appraisers are definitely independent, but somehow that bias goes in there and it's always a higher number, when the seller has done the appraisal. So you want to do your own appraisal.
Okay.
And that's why you have that administrative fund. So, yeah,
You were, let's take an example of an historic project,
yep.
perhaps one that's setting up an organization, even more complicated. Would we be able to say to the applicant, we think you should have this type of consultant
Absolutely.
and we'll help pay for it?
Exactly. I was just about to say, you're very sharp to pick that up.
Don't necessarily have to designate a specific person, but just say,
No, you wouldn't do that because if it was if it was a town thing, it might have to be fairly bid too. You can't really indicate, you couldn't say to them, we want you to hire this person. But that is a very popular thing to do when particularly on historic preservation projects. Every historic project has to adhere to the Secretary of Interior standards, to know that You're not taking a beautiful wood frame building that's been wood for 300 years and they're not going to put vinyl siding, right? That's not the proper historic standards. So a lot of times communities don't have the expertise, or the applicant doesn't have the expertise to interpret those standards. And so a CPC will say, we want you, some of the things here might not be well thought out, or you might not have the expertise to deal with those kind of heavy historic decisions. We want you to have a historic preservation consultant hired as part of the project. But you don't want to make that an unfunded mandate, right?
No,
The city.
I think we say that in our guidelines too,
Yes.
that we will,
Exactly. So you would actually, you probably don't want to make a habit of giving people more money than they ask for, but in that case,
sometimes people don't ask when they should.
right, exactly. And that's your job, is it's not just a rubber stamp. We're going to talk about this in a minute. It's not just to rubber stamp the project that it comes in, but through your due diligence to make that project better. And really, based on your plan and what you've learned from studying the needs of the town to make that project better. And sometimes it's recommending that they spend a little more, or they don't do it piecemeal, that they do it all at once because the cost efficiencies would be better.
Each board has representatives with some background knowledge in these areas to
Right.
spot these things.
Yep. Terrific. All right. So now let's talk about, probably our biggest difficulty in answering questions at the coalition. I'd say 70% of our questions are on what's allowable and what's not. What we call allowable uses of CPA funds, because you think it's simple, but it's not so simple. So the first question that folks ask is, who is eligible to apply for CPA funds? Well, believe it or not, there is nothing about that in the CPA legislation, meaning that anyone can apply for CPA funds. But there are some common themes that come up as a best practice. Typically, the vast majority of CPA money is spent by one of these two organizations, either the town itself, department heads, or other committees applying for funding to do things on town property. And then 501c3s in the categories of CPA, land trusts, historic preservation organizations, recreation organizations, booster clubs, applying to do recreation and historic and open space projects. So those are the typical ones. We urge as a best practice some caution on certain categories of applicants. Again, there's nothing in the CPA law that says yes or no. But typically if you ever get an application from a non-incorporated entity, you don't want to give money to it because there's no real organization. There's no real, tax ID number for that person to receive funding. You don't see that as much in towns, but cities have all these neighborhood associations, and they're just loosely organized folks in a neighborhood that, have been meeting for years and doing great things for their neighborhood, but they're not a real organization with a tax ID number. And so you really only can give money to people who can legally receive that money. A lot of times we get people who own individual historic homes who ask for funds. That is probably not something that you want to do on a one-off basis. You don't want to necessarily be on town meeting floor debating about whether to restore Mrs. Johnson's, front porch that's falling down. Maybe someone doesn't like Mrs. Johnson. Maybe Mrs. Johnson hasn't paid her taxes in a while or is not very nice. But there is a right way to do this. It's not for the faint of heart. You would want to have a professional organization that you would give them a pot of money and then people could apply to them and they'd have the expertise to sort through what work wants to be done, whether it's with the Secretary of Interior standards and the paperwork and all that. There's only 2 or 3 communities that do those sort of things, and they both have huge staffs. Springfield and Cambridge have historic homes programs, but Cambridge has, believe it or not, 6 full-time people in their historic commission staff. I don't know any other town that has even 1 professional person on their historic preservation staff. So they know what they're doing and they've been doing it for a long time. The other one you really need to look at carefully is when you have historic buildings, that are not owned by the town. Particularly nonprofits usually are okay, but particularly if they are commercial historic buildings, we've seen some of that in some of the cities. Or religious institutions. We had a lawsuit regarding that way back in Acton. Which made it much more difficult for religious institutions to apply for CPA funds. There's no broad, absolute prohibition. It's really depends upon the circumstances and what protections are built in. So those are things you want to look at carefully. Some communities do out exterior facade things on commercial buildings. They're right downtown and they really contribute to the character of the town. Lowell does some commercial downtown facade improvements on historic buildings. And we have some communities that are, that have still with some protections, provided money to historic buildings that are used religiously. But we have other towns that don't do it. So those are some areas to look at as the applications come in. These ones just definitely deserve closer scrutiny, a little higher level of due diligence on those types of projects. All right, so this is the most valuable single piece of CPA paper there is. This is what we call the allowable usage chart. Hopefully this is familiar to all of you. This is the simplified version of it. There is the Department of Revenue version, the official one on our website that has all the definitions of all these words. And they all have definitions except for this one, rehab. And the devil's in the details. The definitions are the most important thing in CPA. I'd love for you to, we're all going to read the CPA legislation, all 17 pages. Don't do it late at night. You'll probably fall asleep. But if you're going to read anything, read section 2. That's the definitions, where it tells you what every law starts with definitions. What do they mean? When we use these words within the law, what do we actually mean? And it's really where the rubber meets the road for CPAs in the definitions section. What does it really mean to preserve? What does that actually mean? So here's how you use this chart. I think we all know the 4 categories of CPA, right? That's pretty clear to folks. But unfortunately, CPA is a very limited fund. There's not a ton of money there. And so you can't just do everything that's tangentially related to those 4 categories. You can only do projects in those 4 categories that can be described by one of these verbs. And this is the part that's a lot lesser known, is these verbs. But you need both the verb and the proper category, and you need them both to line up with a yes in the box where they intersect for the project to be legal in CPA. So you have to be acquiring some type of hard asset, creating something, preserving it, meaning protecting it from injury, harm, or destruction, support only in the housing category, or rehabilitating some physical asset. CPA is mostly about physical capital improvements. You have much more flexibility in the housing category, particularly in that verb, to do more planning activities and studies and things like that. But in general, it's fixing up or acquiring or rehabilitating or preserving hard assets in those categories. That's the main bread and butter of CPA.
What does support mean?
Well, support actually was the other word that didn't have a definition in CPA until there were so many wild and local interpretations of what it meant that some town councils were starting to get a little concerned of what communities were interpreting support as. So there's been 12, about to be 13 amendments to the CPA legislation. And we list them all on our website, and our organization has worked on each one of those amendments to CPA to make it better. And one of the amendments was to work with the legislature to write a definition of support. So it's only available in the housing category. I'll answer the question of why in a second, or I'll speculate on why. But it's primarily to create new affordable housing opportunities that are not buildings. So rental assistance programs, first-time home buyer programs. Support can also mean hiring a housing coordinator for the town to work on building more affordable housing. Doing studies or perk tests, if you have to put a well in to build a piece of affordable housing. So it's a nice catch-all. It's a very handy category. It can be, expanded and morphed into things maybe it shouldn't be sometimes. And that is why the legislature didn't want to give that, little bit of squishiness to the other categories. Because they knew, communities are strapped for money and they kind of, seize on that a little bit. The reason they authorize it in the housing category is, we think, everyone knows that housing is the hardest category. Of these four, it's a bear, it's politically charged. It takes years. There's red tape, up and down, and it's expensive, right? So the legislature wanted to give as many tools to communities to build affordable housing. And I'm guessing that in Cohasset, like my town, I live up on the North Shore, and I was chair for 5 years of my local CPC, where I went in front of town meetings 6 times with housing proposals. And anyone want to guess how many we were successful in getting passed? Come on, venture a guess. Anyone want to guess?
0.
1.
0, Tom. Big, and it wasn't close. So, it's a tough category. And that's why the legislature wanted to give as many tools as possible. I'm guessing it's your toughest category, where you've had the least amount of success. Because it's hard and expensive.
But the no is legislatively mandated no's?
Correct, yeah, so this chart is actually the visual representation of section 5B2 of the CPA legislation. 5B2 is part of CPA. It basically says what you folks can approve funding for. It's the allowable uses section, 5B2. But it is a section of law that only lawyers can love. And, you read that and your eyes glaze over. The CPC shall make recommendations for the acquisition, creation, preservation of open space, and for the rehabilitation of open space that has been previously acquired or created with CPA funds. And then it just goes on. It's an entire paragraph of that legalese. And I'll be very honest, we adopted CPA like you in 2001. And I was chair of the committee. I'm not so sure we knew exactly what this law was for. It was brand new. There's nothing else like it anywhere in the state, in the United States. And that paragraph was a little daunting. But DOR came out with this chart, a few years into the program, and it was like a light bulb went off. It's like, oh, okay, now this is what these verbs mean in 5B2. This is how you use it. So it really is very helpful. It makes it easier to determine whether something is legal. Don't confuse that with, is it easy to determine if something is legal? Because it is not a lot of times. And that's, the bread and butter for we do on allowable use. They falls CPC saying, what do you think? We kind of look through the law and look through all the database of past legal decisions we have and all that. And we try to come up with the best common sense answer of whether something's allowable.
How frequent are lawsuits about use of funds?
They're not very frequent, but they're not, unheard of either. Norwell was sued over using funds for sidewalks, which is not allowed. Sidewalks are in the transportation corridor of a road, and they'll be the first thing to go if the town needs to widen the road or fulfill some federal regulation on the road. So those are not recreational assets.
What was the outcome of that lawsuit?
The town lost, and they couldn't do the project.
Don't they have sidewalks now? I thought they built.
They paid for them not with CPA funds. They wanted to use CPA funds
Oh, I understand.
rather than their general funds.
Right.
And the Acton one does that kind of define the universe of?
Well, the Acton one on churches was the only one that went all the way to the Supreme Judicial Court. So the other lawsuits have all been lower court decisions, which means technically they're only binding on that community, on that project. When it goes all the way up the line to the SJC, actually there've been 2, I'm sorry. The Newton lawsuit on recreation in 2007, which led to the changes in CPA with recreation. That also moved up the chain. And when they go into the higher court, then it's binding on everybody. We've had more local lawsuits on environmental, uses, when building a CPA field too close to wetlands, in some people's opinions. We've had Oak Bluffs was sued on churches as well. Wayland was artificial turf, but it's not all that common. And the 10 taxpayer lawsuit is not unique to CPA. That is the same protection that exists for any municipal expenditure. Anytime a town spends money and 10 taxpayers feel it's not appropriate, they can sue. So there's no special dispensation or oversight for CPA. It works the same way everything else does. All right. Yes.
Despite the 17 amendments that you made on your website, are some of the projects that have passed in other towns, are they considered grandfathered? Could you look at them and say, well, it worked in this town
Right.
a couple of years ago?
So what I point out to people when they look through the chart and they find something and said, wait a minute, how did, Hingham do that? If Hingham did it, we can do it. Well, I point to this chart and I tell people, I don't see the word precedent on this chart. Like precedent is not one of the verbs. It's even a verb. I don't know. It's not one of the verbs on this chart, right? So just because another town found a way to do something, doesn't mean that it's legal for everyone else to do. It could be that, the devil's in the details. So sometimes, you see in the database, a broad description of the project, but the conditions they put on it changed it from something that wasn't okay to something that was okay. Like they put a deed restriction on it, something like that, which might not be readily apparent. In other cases, towns make mistakes all the time. You get, there's been about 16,000 CPA projects. You get 16,000 of anything, there's going to be some bad apples in there. There's going to be some mistakes made. 16,000 road projects, 16,000 municipal buildings being built. There's going to be ones that don't go really well. And then, maybe there are towns that, deliberately do things and take a calculated risk. It's not something that we can recommend, especially with money, but, we really don't know. If you see things in there, we're certainly not the CPA police. It's really the local taxpayers who are responsible to kind of look at that and make sure. So that's why this job is, that's why you get paid the big bucks. It's a lot of responsibility. There's no other board in town that has the type of control that the CPC does. There's no other board where no one else can propose spending at town meeting. So, if you want to go up to town meeting and do an amendment or an initiative petition to do something with the schools, you don't need the school committee's approval. You can go and do that. But someone can't propose something for CPA without the CPC recommending it. There's nothing else that works like that. So it's actually a pretty awesome high-level responsibility that the CPC has. You have more control over your piece of spending. Now, granted, it's 1.5% versus the 100% of the regular budget, but it's not an insignificant amount of money, and no one else can spend it without your positive recommendation. On the other hand, you can't spend it without town meetings vote. So there's a nice checks and balances there. All right, so let's quickly go through two examples, one of a thumbs up yes and one a no on using this chart. So let's say you get an application for funding from a private organization, the Historic Society. Do you have a Historic Society in town? Yeah. And they own some type of, oh, I'm so sorry. They own some type of museum building, and I don't know so far that they want to do some rehabilitation on that museum building, exterior facade repairs. So I've never seen that character in the English language before. I have
Portuguese.
no idea what that one is. That is interesting.
French.
And
Oh,
Poussard.
there.
So how do you do your analysis? What do you do to figure out whether it's allowed? So first you have to look at the definition in section 2 of a historic resource. It has to be a historic resource to qualify. That's the first step. And a historic resource is a building, structure, vessel, real property, document, or artifact. Those are the only 6 things that you can spend money on in the historic category. It has to be one of those 6 things. And on top of that, It has to be one of those 6 things that's on the state register of historic places, or the local historic commission has taken a vote to deem it significant. In the same significance that something would be on the state register. So that's a 2-step process. If that asset that you're being asked for, if that building that the Historic Society owns, it wasn't a building and it wasn't on the state register, or there was no vote by the Historic Commission, it ends right there. You can't proceed any further on that step 1. So let's say it is on the state register, or the Historic Commission took a vote to deem it historic. Now you go to the chart, right? And so we have to find a place in the historic category to do that. So are you acquiring that building? Are you being asked to spend money to acquire? No, the Historic Society owns it and they're not looking to sell it. So that doesn't work. Are you looking for money to preserve it, to protect it from injury, harm, or destruction? That's probably more a leaking roof, a fire suppression system, a sprinkler system, probably not preservation, but it clearly is rehabilitation. Bringing that building back to its former glory, fixing up the facade, getting rid of the rotten wood, the falling down, balustrade, fixing the stairs so they're safe. That is definitely a rehabilitation project, and there's a yes in that box. In fact, that's where probably 95% of the historic money gets spent, is down in this box. Probably 95% of the open space money gets spent acquiring conservation land. Recreation, the big ones are creating new recreational areas or rehabilitating the ones you already have. So there are some common themes that come up, but clearly that project would be eligible under support. So now you have to look at the public benefit for a project. Well, when the town applies, there's no question that's to the public benefit, right? The public owns that asset. The public owns every field in town, every building in town. Private organization, we have something called the anti-aid amendment. It's not even a law. It's an amendment to our state's constitution. It's higher than a law, and it can't be changed by a law. This amendment was made in the 1850s. And if you read it, it basically says you can't spend money on a private asset. Can't spend public money on a private asset. Now, it's been interpreted in 150 years through court rulings to say you can't spend public money on a private asset for private benefit, but you can spend public money on a private asset if it fulfills a public benefit. So I know my town every year gives a small appropriation for the Help for Women and Abused Children's program in the neighboring town, because they agree to handle hotline calls from people in our community that need their help. That's a public benefit they're providing. They're a private nonprofit, but it's okay to use public money for that because they're performing a public service. So you have to find ways on every private project. You should have a discussion at the CPC at an open meeting. What is the public benefit of this project? How does it is going to benefit the public? The number one way it can benefit the public is if the town gets a preservation restriction on that building. So if the Historical Society says, we will give the town a preservation restriction, it's an actual document that the town owns. You actually own a piece of that building. You control a piece of that building's future to make sure that it's going to continue to look historic. They're not going to paint it pink and put vinyl siding on it, or rip it down. So you have some protections there. That is absolutely to the public's benefit, that you actually own a piece of that. But there are other ways. Maybe they're going to give public access. Maybe there'll be some type of recapture clause in there. There's a lot of ways to give public benefit, but by far the most popular is the preservation restriction that CPCs will ask for. So you can put conditions on projects, when they apply to you, you can say, yes, we'll give you the money, but we have to have a preservation restriction in return. So that's the way the analysis you have to do on private projects. And then the last step is, okay, it qualifies, and this project does qualify, but is it the best use of our funds? Do we want to do this project? Your job is not just to rubber stamp every project that's legal. If that was the case, you wouldn't need a CPC. The law would have been written as, your town attorney shall review all applications, and those that are legal should be sent to town meeting. But that is absolutely not the job of the CPC to just pass along every legal project, doesn't fit the needs that you've uncovered with your CPA plan. What things are it competing against? We have $600,000 and we have $1.6 million of applications. What's a priority for the town? They all might be legal, but what's the best use of our money? A lot of times you'll get applications, and I know this happened to you recently, of projects that are kind of not ready for prime time. They're last minute. They're not really well thought out. There's a lot of questions that you just can't get your arms around. You just can't. No one knows the answers because they're just rushed or not ready for prime time yet. But that's where the mistakes happen, and that's where the lawsuits come, and that's where the gnashing of teeth and people getting upset happen, is when communities, get out ahead of their skis and commit to something before it's really ready. A lot of CPCs on private projects in particular want to see some skin in the game from the applicant. So if it's going to cost $100,000, hopefully the Historic Society says we beat the bushes and we've raised 20,000, and we need the last 80 to make it done. But usually a lot of CPCs on private projects want to make sure there's some other efforts, that they're not just coming to you and hat in hand for the whole thing. They've really made some effort to get other funding sources. So that's an example of a project that was legal. So let's go back to the chart here, and I'll give you an example of something that wouldn't be legal. So let's say you get an application, from the Historic Society, and they say, we want to do an oral history of World War II veterans. Just read a story in the Globe this week that there were 2,100 World War II veterans left in Massachusetts. Sorry, that was Holocaust survivors. Sorry about that. But there's, probably not many more World War II, veterans around either. And so the Historic Society says, we have 7 in our town. We want to get their stories before they're gone. We want to hire a professional video production company, record these folks, edit it into a 20-minute show. It's going to be on the local cable access TV. The 3rd grade at school has agreed to use it as part of their curriculum on World War II. We're going to put copies at the library for everyone. Great. Right? Clearly a historic project, right? So can you do that project? Well, the first thing is, go to the chart. Are you acquiring a building, structure, vessel, real property, document, or artifact when you're doing that project? You're not. Are you preserving one of those 6 things, protecting it from injury, harm, or destruction? Nope. And you're not rehabilitating one. So right there, that project is not eligible. As a matter of fact, the 2 verbs that fit that project are probably create and support, right? You're creating a brand new video production. That's what you're actually paying for, is to create a new video production. And I love that the legislature really got this right. They didn't allow you to create something in the historic category, something brand new. And it's clearly an activity that is, a great support to the historic preservation activities of the town in the historic category. But CPA can't pay for everything in that category. So that's an example of a project that would not be eligible for funding. It also isn't a building, structure, vessel, real property, or document, or artifact either. So there's a couple of strikes against a project like that. So, any questions on the allowable uses? All right.
I have a question. So historic has to be a structure, a building. It's maybe
Building, structure, vessel, and that means
Vessel.
a boat.
Artifacts.
It does not mean a vase, an antique vase. Building, structure, vessel, real property, the ground where the Battle of Gettysburg took place.
structure be like a cabinet or a box or.
That would be an artifact. So there were 2 things added. Remember, I talked about the 12, soon to be 13 amendments to CPA. In 2006, a lot of communities requested it. We amended that language. Well, we suggested the legislature do it. We can't do it. And they added documents and artifacts to that list of assets. So that would be an artifact. So we've had communities buy, Concord bought a musket that was used in the Battle of Concord from a private collection and restored it and has it on display at the library. Sharon bought a 1930 fire truck that ended up in the woods in Canada, decrepit, and they bought it and fixed it up, and it now leads to all the parades in Sharon. Georgetown restored a horse-drawn hand pumping fire truck from the 1800s that the horse towed to a fire, and then they ran the hose down to the pond and they stood there and pumped it off the pumper. So we've had really cool artifacts. We've had 3 copies of the Declaration of Independence restored with CPA funds, those copies that were sent out to all the towns to ratify.
What about digitizing documents?
Digitizing is not allowed. So it does nothing to protect the actual asset from injury, harm, or destruction. So it's not preservation. You're capturing an image of the document. But we actually had a town call us and say, we're running out of space and we want to get rid of a lot of our historic documents. Can we use CPA money to digitize them so we can throw them out? That is not historic preservation. So, just grabbing a digital image of it and then the document continues to deteriorate because most documents are on acid paper and acid just eats away at the paper. You really have to go through your historic documents, deacidify them. So it didn't make sense to the legislature to allow a digital copy and then let the original asset,
It makes more sense to just let the original disappear.
Say that again?
I said, that would assume that it makes more sense to just let the original disappear,
Yeah.
or digitize it.
Yes,
Wire.
absolutely. Yep. Yeah, that was the example that Concord bought that musket. Sharon bought that fire truck. Absolutely, you can acquire artifacts. We've had communities buy significant paintings. Famous artists do paintings. There is Stockbridge acquired the sign from who's the famous artist who has a museum out there? Norman Rockwell. Thank you very much. Norman Rockwell used to have his workshop downtown, and he painted and made his own carved sign for his workshop. And that ended up in some private collection, and they bought it back with CPA money and then restored it. Now it hangs at the Norman Rockwell Museum. So, yeah, you can do a lot of cool things with artifacts.
Protecting artifacts, though,
Buying them and then
not buying them, but
Preserving.
preserving them.
yes, so preserving artifacts,
That
it
sounds
starts to get into
great.
a little bit degree of separation, right? So CPA in that version, I don't have it up anymore, but that verb preserve can really be expanded beyond what it really should be. So with CPA, preserve means physical work to actually preserve the artifact. So if it's a document, deacidifying the paper. If it's, I don't know if you saw the article, we did a success story on the tercentenary signs, celebrating the 350th anniversary of the Massachusetts colonies. The state in the 30s put up these signs that you see all over the state, these, important, significant history, and they're made out of iron and they've all sort of wasted away. And so they need to be, a treatment put on them, some type of coating to preserve it and protect it from acid rain. So that's kind of preservation activities, but people sometimes want to, so, the town has a historic fire engine, but now they want to build a CPA funds to house the fire engine.
Right.
Like where do you go? It certainly fits the definition of protecting the asset from injury, harm, or destruction to have a 24-hour security guard on that too, or a fire alarm system. But how far away from actual work on the asset do you go? So really CPA is designed for first generation work on the asset, not the degrees of separation from. All right, so we're heading to the end here. I did want to mention, some things about housing, because that was the cause of me being up at the State House today, as a matter of fact. CPA is taking a little bit of heat. You might have even seen some articles in the Globe and Commonwealth Magazine and the Boston Business Journal that a lot of, communities are not lagging a little bit, are lagging a little bit in housing production. And it is the number one problem in Massachusetts. It's not enough affordable housing. It's the number one priority of the Healy administration. There is a real spotlight on housing production now. And we're taking some criticism because a lot of communities haven't done what they should be doing, lagging a little bit on their affordable housing efforts. And we know it's complicated and expensive. But I fear that we're headed for a time in the not so distant future when, you see this in the federal level, where they urge software companies to clean up a little bit of their mess before they come in and regulate, and I think we have a little bit of housekeeping to do in our own world on housing before, unfortunately, someone proposes some things that we might not like about housing. I mean, there's been a lot of talk of some communities build up a lot of money in their housing reserve and don't use it, don't make efforts to use it. And there's been a lot of talk about, taking that back from communities. We don't want to see happen. So, we try to spread the word as much as possible that it's going to take some, outreach effort on the part of CPCs to really bring in developers to talk to them, bring in Habitat for Humanity, bring in community development corporations. It's not a category where you can really sit back and expect that, particularly in a town which has such expensive land values, that you are going to get tons of applications every year. So it's just something we're hoping communities will take a good, close, fresh look at if they're doing everything they possibly can to address the number one problem in the Commonwealth. So I do think some legislation will come down that we might not like. So it's just a word to the wise there. We kind of covered this on the uses of historic. I tried to give a quick thought on each category here at the end. There are some important restrictions in the recreation area of CPA. This is actually a broad prohibition anywhere in CPA. You can never use CPA funds for maintenance or operating expenses. It's for capital improvements. So you can build the soccer field, but you can't fertilize it or pay for the DPW to cut the grass or pay for the insurance bill, in case people have liability insurance. You can't do anything in stadiums with CPA. CPA is for more natural environments like parks and playgrounds. Typically, the only thing in a community that would rise to the level of a stadium would be maybe where the high school football team plays, with very large stands and a big press box, scoreboards, and all that sort of thing. CPA is only for outdoor recreational activities. It's not for anything indoor, unfortunately. We know about no sidewalks. Now, if the sidewalk was within a CPA asset, that's okay. So a sidewalk in a new affordable housing development, that would be fine. A sidewalk inside a park or an athletic field facility, that's fine, but not along roads. And then there also is a prohibition on artificial turf in the legislation. That was never there before, but when we expanded the recreational uses, the hearing at the State House was completely dominated by folks who feared that if we allowed communities to use CPA funds to fix up their fields, that every one of them would be converted to a turf field. And they spooked the legislature a little bit. The legislature does not like controversy. And that delayed that bill for about a year. And there was a little bit of compromise reached on that has worked pretty well. Because these projects are so expensive, usually no one funding source can handle it. So that's what I have for you tonight. We are happy to help you anytime with your CPA questions. You will get a copy of this presentation tomorrow morning with those bookmarks for more information. And then our number is up on the page there. And we're really excited that Cohasset wanted to learn more about CPA and dig in a little deeper. And Russ, you planning to stay, and here you are. So
I'm thinking I probably should do some domestic preservation at home and make.
I have
absolutely.
forgotten a newsletter.
Oh,
And I'm wondering, has everybody else gotten one?
I've not had a newsletter.
you aren't. Okay. So
Has anybody gotten one?
I think I got
You have?
an email. It's an email.
On a regular basis?
Maybe one or two. But I've
Yeah,
got
we
a
don't come
couple.
out every, we do
Oh.
probably every 6, 7 weeks or so. We try not to bombard you.
I'm just, I've got,
Interesting.
I've definitely read it.
Um,
I got
so there are
Funding.
there would be two reasons for that.
Definitely
One is that we don't have the most current email roster. So
Okay.
if someone could send us that, that would be awesome. Maybe we'll reply to our email tomorrow morning. But the other thing is that we find, is we use it, like everyone else, we use a newsletter service called Constant Contact. And sometimes it ends up
Blocked.
in people's spam. So you have to go in there and find it in your spam filter and okay it. And I don't have any cell service here. to Check our database to make sure. I thought we had a pretty accurate list.
I know I've gotten them.
So,
I'll check.
well, I'll tell you what.
Miss that.
I'll tell you what, tomorrow morning, whoever doesn't get a copy of this presentation from either, it's gonna come from chase.mac@communitypreservation.org. That means we have your proper email address. If you don't, shoot me an email. You'll have it on my card. We will check. And if you're in our database, that means it's going to spam.
I also sent you a copy last week of notices going out to this group that you were coming. That has all the most recent members and emails.
Okay, the only thing is that our database puts them in the slot that they hold. So we have to know which person is the historic commission.
Oh.
Versus the housing. Right?
Oh.
Well, let's see tomorrow. Maybe everyone gets it, and then-
Okay, good. That's it.
We can work on that.
Okay.
Jason.
Any questions or comments from the public? Well, thank you, Stuart, so much for
Thank
coming
you very
down.
much.
It's
Come down.
very kind of you.
Anytime.
Good.
Where'd you come in from?
I live up on the North Shore, about as far north of Boston as you guys are south.
Long ride.
Boston. But I had to go to the State House today, so I split up the driving. I went
Yeah.
to Boston and had some meeting at the State House and then came down here.
Well, you were good to do it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
No problem.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. So informative.
Always been very, very responsive.
You've been great. Great. We have some minutes to adopt, but I think I don't have the internet. And I don't know if the people have read them, but Tracy sent them out and they were attached to the thing. So if you could,
A while back, I'm Tracy.
we can get them back out. But if you have the notice for this meeting, the original one, they were attached to that. So you could probably find them in your email thing. But anyway, we won't pass on them today because we don't have them in front of us. But so otherwise, I think the chair is prepared for a motion to adjourn. Bingo.
Excellent.
Second,
Second.
all in favor?
Bye.
Great, meeting adjourned.
Oh,
And that's it.
Thank you.
turn the lights out.
8:35.
Let's